The storm moved in quietly, changing the sky to a dull gray blue. Rain cascaded down the barn's wooden sides, making a persistent drumming sound on the tin roof. The air carried the familiar scent of wet hay mixed with something deeper, like the earth, raw with emotion. While I was feeding the barn cats, I noticed her, Whimper, the untamed mare that had always remained wild. She stood still just outside the fence, her mane soaked flat against her body and her coat smeared with mud. But her eyes were different this time. They weren't fierce or restless. They looked like they were asking for help. From the trees nearby, I could hear a faint, heartbreaking whimper from something small and afraid. That small cry cut through the storm like a sharp note, barely louder than the rain, yet it resonated deeply within me. Without thinking, I dropped the feed bucket on the ground and stepped into the rain, feeling it soak through my flannel shirt almost immediately. The wind whipped around me as I moved towards the fence where Whimper waited. She was no longer the skittish mare I had always known. Instead, she stood firmly, her hooves pressing into the soft earth, breathing steadily. Normally shiny, her dark coat was now smeared with mud and water, but even in this messy state, she radiated strength. Her eyes met mine, not with fear, but with a steady intensity that seemed to both comfort and demand. It was as if she was saying she needed me to help her. Without a moment's pause, she turned and walked toward the trees, and I felt compelled to follow. The woods beyond the pasture were tangled with wet underbrush, remnants of branches from last year, all carrying the rich scent of rain-soaked pine. I navigated through the thick growth, ducking under low branches and stepping into cold, silty puddles. Then she stopped beneath a crooked pine, a broken limb hanging down like a limp wing, shifting slightly to focus on a spot at the base of the tree. There, nestled in the damp earth, was a tiny puppy, drenched through and trembling, hardly noticeable beneath the fallen leaves and dirt. His fur was matted and clung to his skin in uneven patches. Though his eyes were open, they seemed more filled with fear than alertness, dimmed by the cold. I crouched down slowly, extending my hand cautiously to avoid startling him. Yet he remained still. Whimper stood next to me, her presence a comfort. I could hear her steady breathing, underscoring the significance of the moment. This wasn't just luck. She had led me to him, patiently waiting for someone to notice. Gently, I lifted him, careful not to pull him too abruptly from his little refuge under the branches. He felt incredibly light, fragile, as if he were something not fully formed. And he didn't resist. There was no flinching or whimpering, just a slight tremor that ran through his thin body as I cradled him close. His bony ribs pressed against my chest, and when I finally noticed his heartbeat, it was rapid, fluttering like a moth's wings. I wrapped him in my coat and turned toward the clearing, with Whimper matching my pace, neither guiding nor retreating, but watching closely, as if her role in this moment was still unfolding. Once inside the barn, the storm's fury outside felt distant, almost like a different world. I carefully laid the puppy on a soft bed of old towels in the heated tack room. For a moment, I just watched him, uncertain about the next steps. His breathing was shallow and his eyes barely opened. Even without whimpering, a heavy silence surrounded him, as if something inside him had given way to ensure his survival. I took a dry towel and began to rub him gently, working my fingers steadily to bring warmth back to his small limbs. The door creaked open behind me, and I heard Cassie's surprised voice cut through the hush. "Where'd you find him?" she asked. I looked up, but before I could reply, Whimper walked into the room behind her, shaking off the water from her coat, yet still keeping her watchful gaze. The warmth of the tack room, the soft glow of the lamp, and the quiet that followed the storm created a fragile moment, one where it felt like perhaps he had survived the worst. Cassie moved swiftly, checking the pup's vital signs with practiced efficiency. She wrapped him snugly in fleece blankets and placed a warm water bottle against his belly, working to bring him back to safety. Eli arrived shortly after, tracking mud across the floor and gazing at the little creature with wide eyes, as if it were something truly special. We stayed quiet for a while, captivated by the sound of his shallow breathing, allowing ourselves to hope things might improve. Then suddenly, his head twitched. It was an abrupt movement, like something inside him had jolted awake. Fear, memory, pain. I couldn't say for sure. His body stiffened, not from the usual chill of a scared animal, but with an intensity that hinted at something much deeper. His front paw moved out in a quick spasm, his teeth showed briefly, and a soft growl escaped him, high and shaky, but unmistakably there. Cassie went still. "That's not just fear," she said softly. "That's trauma." I took a step back, observing the pup whose ribs still quivered from exhaustion, but his eyes were changing. They were sharp now, and full of fear. Not fear of us, but of something else. Something he had experienced, something that lingered. Outside, Whisper let out a low, rumbling snort, as if she understood we were just starting to uncover the full story. Cassie was the first to move again, her hands steady though her expression was thoughtful. She reached for the stethoscope with a calm born from years of experience. Too many rescues, too many fragile beginnings. "He's not just malnourished," she said quietly as she listened to his heartbeat. "His cortisol levels are sky high. This little guy's body is shutting down from fear. He has definitely been through something significant." Eli sat cross-legged on the floor, resting his arms on his knees, watching the pup with an innocence that couldn't fully grasp trauma, yet still felt its heavy presence. "Do you think someone dumped him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the volume could somehow make it less true. "On purpose?" I held my silence, realizing I was wondering the same thing. There were no tire tracks near the woods, no signs of a campsite or nearby homes. Just Whisper, standing guard in the rain, as though she had decided to protect this little creature from harm. But how had they crossed paths? A wild horse and a puppy. What kind of unseen force brings two such beings together in the same place? Cassie sighed and settled back on her heels. "If we take him in, it's going to be a long journey. He might react with fear, or he may never trust us." Meanwhile, Whisper remained outside the tack room, her damp coat slowly drying in the hay. She stayed close, simply waiting. I began to think about whether she understood something we didn't. The morning after the storm brought a thin, silvery light that crept over the hills, as if it wasn't sure the ground was ready to dry out yet. I went outside to see Whisper, half expecting her to have disappeared back into the wild, as she often did. Instead, she stood just beyond the fence, accompanied by Dune, a larger, darker Mustang with cautious eyes. He watched me approach, his ears twitching and hooves shifting nervously in the wet grass. Whisper remained still, her gaze fixed on the barn. Inside, the puppy Scout, as Eli had named him, was sleeping fitfully. He occasionally sipped water and nibbled at his soft food, but the tremors still shook his tiny body, and each sound startled him. Cassie was already on the phone with a vet clinic 2 towns away, trying to arrange an appointment when animal control called in. Someone had reported horses wandering on private property. "They've received complaints before," Cassie said, keeping the phone wedged between her shoulder and ear. "If they connect Whisper and Dune to us, they'll send someone out. They might even tranquilize them." I glanced out the barn window at the 2 horses standing silently in the mist, their eyes fixed on the door as if they understood what awaited them inside. They hadn't been our choice, but it felt like they had chosen us. Suddenly, this wasn't just a rescue. It was a responsibility that might be taken away from us. By nightfall, the tack room had turned quiet. The storm had subsided, leaving a stillness that settled like dust in the air. The old oil heater hummed softly in the background, providing a warmth that felt less comforting and more oppressive. Scout lay curled up in a cozy nest of towels near the heater, his little body finally at rest, although remnants of tension lingered in his limbs. While he slept, his paws twitched, and an ear occasionally flicked, revealing the shadows of nightmares that still haunted him. I sat on an overturned feed bucket across from him, elbows on my knees, hands clasped, observing this fragile creature who had unexpectedly become the center of our lives. I couldn't shake the image of Whisper's steady eyes from my mind. They seemed to tell me something important, guiding me toward him for a reason. Was that purpose truly mine to uphold? The thought weighed heavily in my chest, a question I had dreaded to voice. Perhaps this situation was more than just about rescue. It might have been about needing something to clutch, a small, wounded creature that reflected the parts of me seeking healing. Amid the quiet, surrounded by the scents of hay, liniment, and damp wood, I began to understand that the toughest challenge wasn't merely saving Scout. It was confronting what that rescue would ultimately require me to let go of. By morning, light returned in gentle patches, rays filtering through the barn slats and pooling across Scout's blanket like spilled cream. I discovered him awake, his head lifted slightly, ears aiming toward Eli's voice upstairs. In his eyes, there was a flicker, something faint, yet unmistakably alive. He wasn't wagging his tail just yet, but he watched intently. Choosing to stay awake felt like a small victory on its own. Cassie arrived just after sunrise, bringing a crate filled with supplies, medical gear, and coffee that tasted earthy and full of hope. We had plans to head into town for a checkup, blood work, x-rays, maybe even a microchip, just in case Scout wasn't always a wild creature. We packed with care, speaking softly to avoid startling him. There, beyond the pasture fence, Whisper and Dune stood still, watching like sentinels. However, when we walked outside, the field was empty. No sign of Whisper or Dune. Then we noticed the hoof prints, deep and fresh, leading away from the fence, sharply directed toward the north ravine, a treacherous place thick with thornbush and steep drops. It seemed only a desperate creature would venture there. Cassie squinted. Something scared them. At first, I wondered if a coyote had come through, but the prints told a different tale. Two sets of hooves, scattered and frantic, suggesting they had been chased. Something must have come close enough to unsettle even the wildest of horses. And Scout, he trembled again, even without seeing the signs. The changes in Scout were subtle, revealing themselves in small moments. He allowed Eli to sit nearby, close enough for their knees to nearly touch. While he still flinched at loud noises and shrank back from quick movements, he no longer cowered when I walked into the room. 2 nights after we found the tracks, I caught him watching the door, ears perked as if he were waiting for Whisper's return. It hit me then. He truly missed her. The connection between that wild mare and this delicate pup wasn't simply about survival. It felt deeper, almost instinctual. A protective bond, perhaps even maternal. Eli had taken to sleeping in the barn loft every night, right above the tack room. He called it a fun adventure, but I noticed how he moved in the mornings, carefully and slowly, as if scared that Scout might vanish if he turned his back for even a moment. Cassie, on the other hand, remained grounded in reality. She often reminded us that Scout's past trauma might linger, that we must be ready for setbacks. Yet, even she seemed to soften a bit. She brought home hand-sewn cloth toys, lingered a little longer after his checkups, and once, when she thought she was alone, whispered his name softly, as if trying to find comfort in speaking gently to something that had known only fear. Outside, though, the tension hadn't eased. We hadn't seen Whisper or Dune since that morning they disappeared. The hoof prints had faded under the sun, but the worry remained. Something had come too close for comfort. While we focused on Scout's healing, the unspoken fear lingered among us, that the danger might still be lurking. If Whisper had really left, perhaps it wasn't just fear that pushed her away. Maybe she felt compelled to confront whatever threat had cast a shadow over us. As dusk settled in and the sky turned a grayish hue, a chill began to creep into the barn. The heater hummed softly while Scout curled up near it, one paw tucked under his chin, drifting in and out of sleep. Cassie stood by the open barn doors, arms crossed, her figure sharply outlined against the dimming light. I recognized that stance. It reminded me of the time we lost a calf to the mountain lions during winter. It wasn't exactly fear, it was a sense of determination shaped by something heavier beneath the surface. "We need to discuss the next step," she said, her gaze focused elsewhere. I understood what she meant even before the words formed. The clinic offered to place him in a trauma foster home, someone who specializes in cases like his. A quiet place, no other animals. "It's a good option, Jonas." Her voice was gentle, but her words felt heavy. I glanced at Scout, watched the rise and fall of his ribs, noticed how he flinched at the touch of a loose strand of hay against his ear before settling back down, trusting that the frightening moment had passed. That trust was hard-earned and hadn't come from any clinic. "What if he doesn't adjust well away from here?" I asked. "What if he thinks he's being abandoned again?" Cassie asked as she stepped back into the barn, her boots making a crunching sound against the old straw. "And what if he never learns to be a dog again because we're trying to fix something we don't really understand?" There was no anger between us, just a painful tenderness that hung in the air. The reality we faced was clear. Loving something wasn't always the same as giving it what it truly needed. Whisper had taught us that sometimes letting go doesn't mean giving up. The barn carried the familiar scent of damp earth and aged wood, mixed with the lingering aroma of hay that had soaked up too much rain over the years. Cassie stayed late that night, and Eli, usually quick to leave, pretended to organize the feed bins, glancing back at Scout every couple of minutes, as if he needed to see proof that the pup was still there. We danced around our true feelings, careful not to disturb the delicate situation that loomed over us. Finally, Cassie pulled me aside, her hands tucked deep in her jacket pockets. "He needs more than we can give him, Jonas. You know that. You've always known that." I didn't respond immediately. I found myself staring past her at Scout, who lay curled up against a folded saddle blanket, finally at peace and no longer trembling in his sleep. That sight should have provided comfort, but instead it left me feeling emptier. "He trusts us now," I said. "He trusts me." Cassie nodded, her voice gentle. "Yes, and maybe that's why it has to be us that lets him go peacefully." Eli, who had been within earshot, spoke up with a crack in his voice. "You're giving him away?" I turned toward him slowly, seeing the heartbreak etched on his young face. It twisted my stomach. "We're trying to do what's best," I said. "But what if we're what's best?" he asked, urgency in his tone. "What if he chose us, just like Whisper did?" The barn fell silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. That was the crux of our dilemma. No one was necessarily wrong in their thinking, yet a decision needed to be made. The quiet between us wasn't cold or angry. It was heavy, like the pause between a heartbeat and what follows. We all understood the weight of our choice. The night before the decision felt unsettling from the beginning. The air was unnaturally still, with no wind for the first time in days. The hills surrounding the ranch seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting for what was to come. The sky was overcast, casting a muted light over the barnyard as I stepped outside, craving some fresh air. Scout was asleep again, more peaceful now. The tension that once defined him had eased. But my own restless feelings had nowhere to land. Out of habit, I walked the fence line, checking the gates and scanning the edge where the field met the woods. That's when I noticed her. Whisper. She was alone this time. Standing just beyond the eastern fence, she seemed almost ethereal in the dim light, her coat dusty rather than glistening from rain. She didn't move closer, nor did she make a sound. She simply watched, and in her eyes I perceived no haste or fear, only a deep sadness, an emotion that weighed heavily in my chest. It struck me, painfully clear. She had returned for a reason, not to guide me or to defend Scout, but to allow him to go. Inside the barn, Eli and Cassie were at it again, their hushed voices tinged with grief disguised as rational debate. Eli wanted to hold on to Scout, while Cassie felt the need to make the right choice. And there I was, caught between two strong beliefs that felt equally valid. Scout stirred beside me, releasing a sound that wasn't quite a bark or a whine, just the sound of breath shifting quietly. Whisper remained fixed in her gaze. She wasn't waiting. In that moment, I understood. Whatever decision we made next would lead us forward, with no chance to look back. As morning crept in slowly, it cast a faint golden glow across the barn floor that did little to lift the chill or the weight in my chest. The tack room felt different that day, calmer, somehow still, as if even the space recognized that this was no ordinary morning. An old crate sat by the door, its wire gate opened, ready for what was to come. Cassie had filled it with soft fleece, and Eli had added one of his old flannel shirts, the one Scout loved to curl up in. No one spoke goodbyes. Instead, we moved quietly, the gravity of our situation settling between us like dust illuminated in the sunlight. Scout lay beside me, his body pressed against my leg. This wasn't out of fear, but perhaps something gentler, trust, maybe. He had stopped trembling days ago, and while a shadow still lingered in his eyes, there was now a flicker of light at the edges. I ran my fingers gently over his neck, feeling the warmth of his patchy fur beneath my touch. His head lifted just a bit, and our eyes met for a brief moment, but it felt significant. It was enough to acknowledge an unspoken truth. He wouldn't be mine for long. Yet in this moment, he had been mine. This phase of his recovery held a special meaning. Cassie knelt down, speaking softly and carefully, choosing her words with care. "He'll be safe. The woman has plenty of forest land. No noise, no pressure, just space and patience." But her words didn't bring me comfort. They felt more like a reminder of loss disguised as reassurance. Gently, I lifted him, cradling him against my chest one last time, feeling his warmth settle in a way I didn't know how to let go of. He didn't fight it. He just watched as I placed him in the carrier, his head resting on Eli's shirt, his eyes calm, almost as if he was ready to leave. As I stepped outside, I saw Whisper standing still, just beyond the fence, with the morning light highlighting the white streak across her face. She didn't move, she was simply there, observing. A quiet presence marking the end of a chapter I was only beginning to grasp. In that moment, I understood why she had stayed. Sometimes, an animal comes into your life, not for you to save, but to teach you how to let go with love. Weeks have passed since Scout left the barn. The tack room feels emptier without him, though his scent still faintly clings to the towels we couldn't bring ourselves to wash. Eli no longer sleeps in the loft, but occasionally I see him by the gate, hands in pockets, gazing toward the hills, as if waiting for Whisper to appear again, her silhouette breaking through the fog like that first night. But she hasn't returned. The woman sends updates, kind notes filled with photos of Scout lounging in sunny spots on a wooden porch, his fur looking fuller, his eyes shining. She tells me he's quiet but curious, still startled by sudden sounds and cautious around men, yet he now follows her from room to room. She assures me she doesn't rush him. He approaches her when he feels ready, and she lets him stay as long as he needs. Sometimes in the quiet of the evening, I sit on the back steps of the barn, nursing a cup of coffee that has turned cold, and I wonder if Scout remembers the scent of hay when the rain falls on the roof. Does he recall the warmth of Eli's flannel or the sound of my boots pacing just outside his stall? I believe he does. Not because it's painful, but because it signifies that what we offered him, no matter how fleeting, made a difference. Rescue isn't always straightforward. It can leave you with lingering questions and what-ifs, along with pieces of yourself scattered in places you might never revisit. Yet, it also opens you up in ways you might not expect. And sometimes, if you're fortunate, a wild horse might come into your life, showing you the bravery it takes to walk away. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the bittersweet ache of letting go, or if you've experienced the unexpected joy of being chosen by an animal, you are already part of this journey. Scout's story is not merely about rescue. It touches on connection, timing, and understanding, when love means holding on and when it means letting someone go. For more stories like this, stories that don't always have a perfect ending but are always filled with meaning, consider subscribing to the channel. You might also share this video with someone who could use a reminder that even small, imperfect things can lead us to something greater. If you have a personal story about an animal that touched your life, please share it in the comments. We read every single one. Sometimes, healing isn't about saving. Sometimes, it comes from simply seeing.